All right, here we go.
What's good, everybody? I'm Robert Dickens Jr.
This is Ryan Reed.
This is Elanders Frazier.
This is John Gaal, and you're listening to Volta.
Changing the conversation
For percussion educators,
Designers,
And performers.
Hey everybody, what's up? Welcome to another episode of Volta Percussion. I'm joined here by John Gaal and Robert Dickens Jr. He may be popping on with us a little bit later. We'll see, but we got an interesting topic today for those of you starting the marching band season on critique, judges' tapes, what's important, what's not important, or what's less important, and just deciphering through all the information that you get through that process. So, has anyone started their marching band season yet?
You mean competitively?
Competitive season, yes.
Like, no, everyone is just starting movement one.
Nah, I think we have BOA Chattanooga this weekend. I don't know when this would air, but yeah, we're headed out for our first one this weekend.
Nice. Yeah, we just had our first BOA show this past weekend. So kind of to tag off that, just listening to tapes and whatnot, I'll start by saying that be selective in terms of when you're listening, the information that you're taking down. And I know,
Ryan, can you give a little context for our listeners, like where you're from right now and what competition you went to this weekend?
Yeah. So we went to BOA Louisville, and we had a really awesome panel. And we had some electronic issues where some of our bass drum and gong stuff got caught into our field mics. And when that stuff gets caught into field mics and gets a little overplayed, it gets real loud. and and obviously every music judge talked about that. And I think in that instance, that's one of those things where at BOA, there's no critique. But if you're going into a critique, obviously every music judge talks about that. I think that's something that you sweep under the rug pretty quick. You say, hey, we had some electronic issues. We know that the bass drum and gong was too loud because it got caught up in the microphones, that kind of thing. That says, hey, we know it's an issue, not super important to talk about, because critique is really your time to address the things that you want to address off of the tapes, not necessarily the time to go in and be like, so what'd you think? Because they gave you their tapes on what they think. So I think you got to put into context, like, what did you know the issues were? That kind of thing. One thing I like to do when I go into critique is go, if it was a rough run, just say it. Just say, hey, not our greatest run. And that kind of steers the conversation away from, like, if it was a bad run, but it was the best the kids could do, that's one conversation to have in a critique. But if it was a bad run and it wasn't the best the kids can do, you don't need to talk about some of that stuff of, like, training and making sure that all the kids know what the musical line is going and that kind of thing. So do any of you have any experiences in critique kind of like that, where you took either information away and you're like, hey, we don't need to talk about this, or hey, we really need to dig into that?
Yeah, I would say teaching in A and open, I feel like the conversations become a little bit different. I feel like definitely starting out as an educator and working with an A-class group, some of my first questions were about training and stuff, like you mentioned before, is like, one of my go-to questions is like, is the training of the students evident? As it relates to their performance quality, how they move, how they sound, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like once you kind of get out of that classification and you start going to other classifications, a lot of those things are already pretty simple and pretty, like, understood that, like, okay, your students are trained on a certain level. So that's not necessarily the commentary that you want to get. And I feel like when you're approaching the critique process, specifically if it's a prelims finals thing, getting a chance to go into critique, specifically if you've gotten someone that's kind of just giving you like a tick tape, going in and talking about and addressing, like you said, some of the training issues, if it was a bad run or this, that, or whatever, like just assuring them that those students already know those things, but that they need more commentary on like how well they're performing what they're doing, I think can lead you to a better tape during a finals run. Because sometimes, judges don't necessarily know, unless they're familiar with your group, like how well your members are trained. They don't know, okay, well, do students know, okay, even when they take a knee, they visually need to make sure they still keep a straight spine and they're aware of their posture, or as they have these lower body responsibilities, how to separate upper body from lower body, blah, 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 blah. Like, they don't necessarily know that. So sometimes they could be giving you a tick tape just because they're unaware. But I feel like sometimes if you get into the critique process and you let them know, hey, that wasn't a strong run for us, or hey, we're learning X, Y, and Z. These are things that the members are all aware of. So that's good information. Then you can kind of guide them during the finals commentary to give you the commentary that might be missing from your students and also missing from your instructors if you've been telling them about something like musically or design wise that maybe they're not connecting on.
But here's a question. Let's say you're hearing this commentary about, let's say, again, they need to understand that when they take a knee, their spine needs to be straight, their lower and upper body responsibilities, et cetera, et cetera. You've talked to the students about this almost every rehearsal, and yet maybe in the heat of the moment they forget, whether they're because they're young, or maybe there were elements that day, whether it was heat or other variables that just affected the mental focus of the group. And you hear that comment again on the tape. Like, how do you take that without getting frustrated? Because I would say you should still share that with the students, saying, hey, we've been mentioning this in rehearsals, it's being picked up in the judges, we got to keep working on that. But how that do you personally not feel that, not as an attack against you as an instructor, but just like, oh, come on, I've been saying that and they're saying it too, and it's just frustrating. So how do you guys deal with that situation?
I think in those situations when I've been saying stuff to the students, I usually end up playing the tapes for them, and that's not something that I do a lot of, just because, again, you have to be able to siphon through a lot of that, what the judges are talking about, and they're reacting live, usually to a first, maybe a second read. So I don't want to confuse students with anything that could be misconstrued or anything that is more for me on like a design side of things. But if there's something, especially on like the performance side of things, or like the downstairs tapes, that has been said to the kids multiple times and they haven't done yet, I'll play the tape for them and be like, hey, they're talking about this, and it reflects, we'll talk about the recap and it reflects in the score this way and this and that. And then I went to critique and we talked about it again. So we just have to make that of the utmost importance in these upcoming, however many rehearsals you have left. So that's usually how I'll treat those situations.
Yeah. I would say at this juncture with my schools, as far as indoor is concerned, I've been very explicit with them about what the intent is. And sometimes judges can misread the intent. And if they don't necessarily understand that intent, like Ryan said, that's not something that I would play for the members, just because that's a conversation for me to have between myself and the judge. You know what I mean? Like, there might be a moment where a judge was like, oh, okay, well, I really wanted to hear more of this thing, but the sound, I felt like the sound design was kind of like covering it up. There's too much wind noise or whatever, ambient soundscape. Well, if I go in there and if I play that for my students, then they can feel like, oh, okay, well, we're playing too loud. When in actuality, it might have been, that's the intent, is that the students are ambient sounds that are happening within the wind soundscape, etc. That's a conversation that I should have with the judge to say, okay, this is the intent. And I think that brings up a really important point, especially as it relates to critique and effect. Being able to clearly explain what you are intending to do, and also getting a judge's like blind reaction to that, I feel like is a good gauge on like how your effect is coming across. That's not to say necessarily that you should change something because it doesn't affect a person a certain way, because I think that some people might read it as minimal or, mysterious, intriguing, whatever. And another person might read it as, what are you trying to get across to me? You know what I'm saying? Because everyone has different styles of like what affects them. So I feel like going into the critique process and talking about the intent of what you did and drawing lines in between things for them to listen to the next time, I think are all really important things. I think one of probably the two questions that I thought about this year over the summer with Southwind that I felt like were really good questions were like, what did you feel like was the strongest moment in our show that like we can continue to heighten? And then what was the moment that you felt like was the most challenging that like we need to make this moment better? You know what I mean? Like I feel like that gave me a good gauge on like what part did they really remember and what was their like snapshot impression, and then what was like the negative snapshot impression of like things that we can make that better and like elevate the entirety of the program basically.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think those are really good questions because it's very telling when you go into critique, especially if your group goes on early and you have critique later, like what is the judge left with? Both negative and positive. Because if it's positive, that means like it's really positive. And if it's negative, that also means like, hey, that should probably be priority number one as you're in the planning stages of that. So I think those are great questions in terms of just helping you plan for your upcoming weeks.
I also want to say I want to backtrack a little bit for our audience members. Sometimes, depending on what shows you perform at, they don't offer critique. They just give you the tapes, and that's it. What it is, and that's either because the amount of groups that are there, they just don't have the time for all the band directors to meet all the judges, or it just be that's how that specific circuit is set up. I know here in Texas, we go, at least here in the Fort Worth area, there's a couple local circuits we do before our UIL assessment, which is basically like the big marching band state assessment that determines if you're hitting all the boxes like you should be musically and visually, and then that allows you to go to the state and then compete in your school size, classification, etc. And so one example is for our band specifically, we go to a competition called Preview of Champions. It's in Mansfield, Texas. Really great competition by Mr. Will Ludlow. His team, it's a great venue, great staff, great support crew with all the volunteers. They have everything set up and it runs very efficiently. So if you're looking for a band competition and you're in the Texas Fort Worth area and you want some extra practice that's not UIL, not sponsored, but yeah, I think they do a great show. We've been to the Midlothian one. They also do a really great show. But for this year, we're going to the Preview of Champions show, and that's going to be next week. Whenever you guys are listening to us, maybe it's already going to be done. But I remember specifically in that show that the judges are just up in the box. So we don't have any field judges like you may have in a BOA show or a DCI competition or whatnot. And so we just have judge tapes and there's no critique at the end. And I just want to say, because I don't have a critique opportunity at the end of the show to bounce ideas of what I hear from the tapes from the judges, I do have to take what they say with a grain of salt, right? It has to go through a filter. Just because they say something doesn't mean I need to change something. I want to say that again. I'll say that again. Just because they say something doesn't mean I need to change something. Now, sometimes I do, because I remember last year, one of the judges mentioned something about our narration or our sound samples. And so he was calling in the question if that was legal in anticipation for our UIL assessment. And that was something I've read the rules, but it brought a good reminder just to double check that all my boxes were in the right order before the big assessment, right? The UIL assessment. So sometimes judges bring in unique perspectives that, as a band director, there's just myself and the other directors. Sometimes we're so focused on teaching the dots and the music or the body, visual package, whatever. Sometimes we lose our way in the overarching artistic design or the entire musical package, that by having those judges up in the box areas, they're able to provide those fresh perspectives of, oh, hey, in this section, the woodwinds were a little underbalanced compared to the brass section, and but it sounded like they had the melody. So, okay, on my band field, I didn't hear that. So what are they hearing? And so I can listen to the tape. So and then some other times they could be saying, "Oh, the drums are too loud here," and you're like, "Well, yeah, it's a drum break. It's supposed to be really, really loud. I get that." So whatever they say, you always take with a grain of salt and filter through it. Write down the notes. I'm sure you're going to be watching your video and going through your score study and doing a lot of conversations with your techs and your other directors. I get that. But just because they say something doesn't mean you need to change something, because, again, it's their first read. They're seeing a lot of bands, and there's so many other variables that can make it, whether it's a good show or a bad show.
Yeah. John brought up a really good point, and I guess we're going maybe a little out of order in this episode, just given our random thoughts about critique and whatnot. But when you're listening to tapes, do you have a process for taking notes that kind of helps either if you have critique, that helps guide your conversation and critique, or if you don't, that helps guide maybe the conversations your staff is having, or anything along those lines? Do you have like a process for listening to tapes and taking notes?
I know, at least for me, I'll take it from the perspective of drum corps, specifically with Southwind. I was on the road, and I listened to the percussion tapes, but I also listened to the GE, the music analysis, those other tapes that were kind of within my field and that I should have been made aware of, since I was kind of helping run the group at that time when I was on tour. But whenever I listen to tapes, and typically they're used through Comp Suite. For those that don't know, it's an app that typically judges would just upload their audio recordings. Some people still use paper copies and whatnot, but I think most people who are listening or around the country are using Comp Suite, Competition Suite these days. But basically, the judges in each of the categories upload their file. And so for me, I would listen to the percussion tape first, and I just open up my notes and I just listen to him in real time, whatever he's saying. And since I have more information, since I hear the music every single day, I know exactly what it's supposed to sound like. And when he's saying something, I can visually see the music in my mind, and I can just make a quick note of what he's saying. Typically, I'll write down big question marks. Maybe he's saying a certain phrase or a word over and over, like the phrasing in this section, or dynamic contrast, or simultaneous responsibilities, or whatnot. And if he's saying certain phrases over and over, then I can start going through my who, what, when, where, why, how type questions of, okay, you mentioned this. I know what's happening there. How are you coming to that conclusion? Because I know that I'm going to have a critique opportunity at the end of the show. Whereas in high school, like, I would just listen to the tape and just write down maybe some big flag issues. And then when I'm on my own time away from the director suite, enjoying all the nice food that they give us, right? And I've let myself decompress. Obviously, I'm going to listen to the tapes again, and I can go through my musical score and be like, okay, he mentioned this. I'm going through my notes. I'm circling. What is he mentioning? What is he seeing that I'm not? So depending on the situation, I have kind of two different approaches of just making some big picture bullet points. And then also, depending again on the context, maybe just doing some circles or writing down some notes in my phone, so I can come back later and see what's going on. What's your process, Rob?
Pretty similar. I think most times, by the time we get to the critique process, I'm aware of where those things are in the score. So if there's things that I have two things. So one, if there are things that, like, the judge, he or she has a question about that I can bring clarity to, I definitely make sure that that's written down. That, like, oh, okay, this is something that maybe the students aren't playing that well. I would say, depending on classification, sometimes you could ask, like, okay, do you feel like this part is appropriately written for them? Do you feel like the juice is worth the squeeze for how difficult this part is? Because I mean, sometimes you're a younger director or you're a younger designer, like you don't know. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, okay, I'm gonna have my kids play these crazy splits or something like that. Like, is that musically effective enough to be worth us continuing to rep it? And God honest truth is whether or not the setup is good enough. You know what I mean? If the setup is good enough to create that vacuum of sound and then, clear out and then you guys play that split and it's really, really, really good, it could be very effective. But depending on the context, it might not be worth it at all because it doesn't really add anything to the story. You know what I mean? It's just something else. So I think that's a viable question sometimes. But my first go-to is definitely bullet points. I'm a big bullet point person in general. Anytime I go to rehearsal, I probably got like 10 bullet points per like section of music. So
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about, okay, this needs to be better. This needs to be better, and I try to condense them as much as I can to make them overarching things for the students so that they know, like, my battery kits, upper battery kits, which is a stock comment. Like, hey, everything that we're playing is in like less than 170. Let's make sure that like we have fulcrum pressure and we're using our wrist, right? To just support the stuff so that we don't scratch a whole bunch of rolls and stuff like that, which is like a pet peeve for me. But from a critique standpoint, anything that I see that the judge is a question about, I'm definitely going to write that down, and I'm probably going to put the answer out to the edge if I know what that is, so I can clear that up in critique so that the next time they can be like, oh, they intended to do that. That's the way that fits. If there's something that the judge is not acknowledging, because I think we've all gotten a whole bunch of variety of tapes, right? You get the tape where the person's like talking constantly nonstop and they just miss every single moment. You get the person that's giving you a tick tape, and because this one thing wasn't good, they talk through the next thing that was good. Then you get the okay, yeah, okay, snares. All right, like you get that tape, right? So all of those tapes, I feel like the critique process is a little bit different. The judge that's talking a lot, obviously, you might want to bring their attention to some of the moments and like, take some of the things and just talk about what you're doing. The judge that's the judge that doesn't really give a lot of commentary, for me, I want to go in and ask questions as to like, because sometimes I think one of the issues is like when you get a tape and then you get like a really low score, it's like you're trying to like decipher between the two. So my question to you guys, because I know how I handle this, but my question to you guys is going to be, how do you handle a low score that you feel like is lower than is accurate for the composition and also the achievement of what the students are doing, but the judge didn't really give you commentary on exactly, you know what I mean? Like the numbers aren't matching the commentary in that way. How do you guys deal with that?
I think
Ryan, you want to jump on that one?
Yeah, for me, I try to take some context with it. I do most of my critiquing and judge tape listening in the winter season, so I'll take it from that angle of, do I know if the judge is a WGI judge? And do I know if I'll be seeing the judge again? Because those things will help me guide the conversation a little bit with them. There's always going to be times where you got to kind of take that stuff with a grain of salt. And I try to ask questions specifically based around like what we've been doing in rehearsal that might not even pertain to the performance in that aspect. I spent a lot of time, we used lights this past winter with my concert group, which is not technically on the sheet, but I spent a lot of time talking about like, is this effective? Did it make you feel a specific way? And I tried to always guide the conversation in that direction, especially if and when tapes didn't feel like they had depth to offer. The tick tape being one of those things. Like, I always feel like I'm not great in critique when it comes to like the PA judge. I'm like, all right, we were clean. All right, we were dirty. You caught it all. Great. Okay, next 2.5 minutes. But I'll ask them just questions about, like, does this achieve the emotional reaction that I'm going for, that I think it does, that kind of thing. So if you get a tape and a score that doesn't quite match up, a lot of times, like, I think you got to steer the conversation in whatever direction you want, and understand that there are descriptors that go with every box as well. From a performance standpoint, I use these also with my rubric in my class, but like WGIs of like rarely, occasionally, rarely, sometimes, usually, always, and never, for the 5 boxes. And if they're bringing up those descriptors a lot, or they're bringing up their own descriptors of like awesome, great, those kinds of things, and then the numbers don't match, you can always ask, like, how do the descriptors, where's the discrepancy between the descriptors you're using on the tape and the final number that you're putting down? Is that a bad last impression that we're leaving because you said this about all these things, but then your numbers here? Just help me connect the dots on that. So I think there's multiple ways you can go about that in terms of like the verbiage they're using on the tape, and then asking them to basically share their rationalization of like these descriptors and this number. And there's also the way of like, for me, sometimes the number doesn't matter because it's just a local show. So just, did I get the information that I need from you?
Yeah, I'll take it like from a high school marching band standpoint. I think what you mentioned, Ryan, is really important, is those like 5 really big descriptor words of, I think what you said, rarely, sometimes, usually, consistently, and always, something along those lines. I think you start with that, and if you're hearing that on your tapes, that helps lead the conversation with your own students of as they evaluate, right? What is it, Bloom's taxonomy of higher learning? Right? As you're changing the question format and getting that higher idea of learning, of, okay, students, I want you to evaluate one of the higher levels instead of just like, how do you think that went, or what happened here? They can like evaluate this portion of the show. Were we consistently playing our music all in tune with the right dynamic shaping? Were we usually doing it, et cetera, et cetera? And I think that really helps from an educational standpoint, continue the conversation with your students as you're elevating their musical journey, because they're young kids at the high school level. Maybe they're not, like Avon High School, BOA, Grand Nats. Maybe you're just a local high school and you're going to a local circuit. Having those conversations, starting with those 5 big keywords, I think helps elevate everyone's awareness of, am I actually doing it to the best of my abilities? And if not, what do we need to do throughout the rest of the season so that the whole program takes it to the next level, goes to that next keyword of, if we're at, usually, how can we make it consistently? If we're at consistently, how can we make it always? If we're at never, then that could be a director issue, right? But I also want to talk about, so that's from a high school perspective. From a drum course perspective, Rob, would you mind repeating that question one more time? Because I think that's slightly different. I think it was with the tapes, right?
Yeah. How do you handle the discrepancy between a lack of commentary and a low number? Because I feel like when you get a lot of commentary, or at least for me, when I know I'm going to get a low number, I expect that judge to just like read me from like minute 0 to minute 6, like this, boom, boom, boom. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, okay, I got it. But sometimes I think there's sometimes where people's commentary doesn't necessarily seem to match their number. And you're trying to figure out, like Ryan was saying, like, what's the rationale that you use to come to this conclusion? Because I can't hear it on the tape as to how you got to this place, this box that you place this in.
Sure. I want to talk about it from a DCI perspective. Now, for those that don't know, DCI, I think DCI But there are some sheets, I think there's judging sheets that go into quite detail for the judges. Again, talking about those 5 keywords, but also from an achievement standpoint and a content standpoint, bold words that judges should be saying on their tapes. So, for example, I pulled up the percussion field sheet right here. So you have the content score and the achievement score, and I'm sure everyone listening to this already knows this, but for those that maybe are unaware, so under the content, the judge should be talking about the musical and technical vocabulary, the clarity, the simultaneous responsibilities, and then it helps the judge, have that conversation. To what degree is the creativity and the variety and the range of content happening, et cetera, et cetera. And then the similar stuff for the achievement. So I would say if you're getting tapes, again, with the drum corps perspective, and the judge isn't saying much, number one, if you're ever going to critique, I believe it's your responsibility to check out those sheets every time before you go. The more knowledge you have, the more power you have, so you can have those deeper conversations, not so that you are aggressive in your conversations. But I would say critique is a great opportunity for you to also fight for your students, fight for your program, fight for the show design, because either maybe if it's a first time judge or first time the judge is watching your show, they could just be out of position. And that's happened. I know I was with the Colts. That happened a few times early on, right? Early season. Everyone's trying to figure out where to go. And it's your responsibility in the critique to help kind of lead, hey, judges, we have a battery break at the beginning of this movement over on side 2. And then maybe you want to come check out this marimba feature. Now, whether they actually do it or not is up to them. And as more judges watch the shows and do more research, hopefully they get those big moments. But you have to advocate, especially in critique. If that judge is not providing commentary and they give you a low score, but you were there and maybe you believe it should have been better, you have to advocate of, okay, this is what the sheet says. You didn't say anything on the sheet. Why are you giving me that score? And accountability, holding them accountable, you don't have to be afraid of that, because that's their job, and it's your job to make sure that they're doing their job correctly. And if they can't back up their lack of information to you, then it's okay to talk to the chief judge and call them out for that. And I feel that sometimes we as instructors forget that we also have some power. Again, not in a perspective of it's a me versus you mentality, because I don't think judges by and large do it with an ill will perspective. I think everyone's trying to get the best read of that run so they can help you along the way to the best of their ability. And of course, like Rob and Ryan already mentioned, people critique in different ways. They comment on the judge tapes in different ways. But if you're finding that the commentary is not saying what the sheets are saying, then you as a adjudicator, it's your responsibility again to advocate for your team and to have those hard questions of, why did you put this down? Because there was nothing on your tape that signifies that we should have gotten that score.
Yep. I definitely had that experience this summer, towards the end of the summer. And I feel like another great question to ask in some regards, depending on where you are, is, how's your season been going? Like, where are you in the season? Like, is this your first show? Have you seen other groups? Because especially with the critique process, I feel like one of the things that people kind of shy away from is the comparative analysis part of the critique process, specifically once you get towards the end of the season. And you're wondering, like, how does my group stack up against this group or that group or whatever? I feel like that's a viable question to ask, is like, do you feel like our vocabulary and musicality is comparable to these groups? Do you feel like, our simultaneous responsibility is comparable? Our clarity is comparable? If that is the case, DCI and WGI has descriptors and numbers that show you whether or not if this group is comparable to this group, this is the kind of range that they should be in, right? So for instance, a judge can't say, oh, okay, well, you're comparable to group A and we're group B, but group A is 3 points ahead of us. That's not comparable, right? Like there's a gap there. They're putting that gap there because they're saying these two things are not comparable to each other. But if we're like within a point or like 1 point behind, like that's showing a degree of how comparable we are. So I feel like as instructors, like it is incumbent upon us to ask those questions when we get into a critique process and not be afraid to say, hey, we've been close to this group all summer. We've been close to this group this winter, and we've been getting scores that are comparable. Where do you see us with the groups that were there? Or the same thing with DCI, outdoor stuff. Because I'll say, for instance, my experience confronting a judge about a score that I felt like was inaccurate. That was probably the first time that that's ever happened, but I'll tell you the exact way that I walked into it with a very nice way that I did it, which was I know what things we have designed into the show and what things the students do well. And there were some things that I felt like we didn't get credit for, specifically dynamic shaping and, all of these, colors and timbres and stuff that we're presenting. I, one, did not hear that on the tape. Two, I did not hear, the dynamic shaping and this, that, and whatever. So I simply asked as a question in the critique, was the dynamic shaping and musicality of what we played, was that apparent? And he said, yes. He said, I feel like that was a very big, strong suit for you guys. And I was like, well, that was not on tape. And then I just paused for effect. And just wait to see what he had to say. So that was my opening to be like, and he was like, well, and I was like, yeah, like that's the reason why I'm asking these questions, is because the other thing is sometimes judges will say, specifically, I guess if you're not going to see him again, like this number doesn't necessarily matter. I understand that you're advocating for the members and whatever, blah, 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 blah. But judges do have comp suite. They do look at the trend of numbers with certain groups and who they're compared to. It does have a little bit of an effect, so I feel like as a director, you don't need to go in there and hypothetically, allegedly, go, 1980s cadets and like threaten the judges. I say allegedly. I cannot prove that. I was born in 86. I don't know. But I will say you don't have to be afraid to disagree with a judge. You don't have to be afraid to say, no, the intent for this show was to do less with more. Like less is more. That's the way that this show is. Because, for instance, visually, I've had instances where some judges feel like, oh, okay, there's a feature moment and there's a secondary moment that's behind that should be filled in. Well, if your show, like for instance, one of my group last year, their indoor show was called Soul. It was about loneliness. Well, that was one of the things that we cut out specifically when people did solos and features, was like we didn't have a secondary moment. Like that one group was performing by themselves and everyone else was standing there. Now, one judge could say, well, this feels unsupported. There's things in the score that I hear that I feel like should, you could visually use. But there were other, adjudicators that felt like, wow, I see that you're intentionally not doing anything. Because there's other moments where you have everything filled in. I see the intention of this. So a lot of those things are people's opinions, but I feel like as an educator, a designer, like John said, you got to advocate for your kids. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be like contentious, but it does mean that you have the opportunity to be direct.
Yeah, you have to stick up for your design. Now, if you're buying a design from someone else, you still need to support that design in however way you can. But if you're especially creating the musical package or the visual package, and you're in there in the thick of it, and you're going to those competitions, like you need to have a reason why you're doing some stuff. And maybe if you don't have a reason and the judges bring that to your attention, that's a good opportunity for you to elaborate on that moment, or at least to get the wheels turning for next year of, okay, I'm going to design a new show. I got called out for this on this past season. What can I do planning ahead so that doesn't bite me in the butt again?
Well, yeah, the biggest thing I think to take away from the whole idea of critique is that it's our time, whether that's our time to advocate for our students and our organizations, or our time to pick the brains of, quote unquote experts in our field. I think it's our time to lead the conversation in whatever direction we want to go, whether that's benefiting our group, benefiting ourselves, trying to learn, all that. Listening to your tapes is the number one priority after a show, to go into critique with all the information you need. But then after that, it's having a plan. One of the best critiques I ever had was last year. I went in and I sat down, and this was with the music judge, not even the effect judge, but we were talking through a moment, and he just didn't quite buy it. And sitting at the table, I just had an idea, and I said, hey, what if we, like, this is what we're trying to get to, what if we did it this way instead? And he sat there and thought for a second. I was like, yeah, I would totally buy that. So we went into the next rehearsal, changed how that transition worked, and it ended up being one of everyone's favorite moments, including myself. And it wasn't even my idea, but I got that sitting down and just having a conversation, and not necessarily having a checklist that I wanted to get through, but like, I want to talk about this thing and that kind of stuff. And then having those conversations after critique, with your staff, with your directors, all that kind of stuff. But the biggest thing is just knowing that critique and tapes are for you to get something out of them. And as Robert said earlier, scores, because there's information in the numbers, that kind of thing too.
Yeah, I would think of it like a checkpoint, right? You're in your daily grind. If it's WGI on the weekends, drum corps every single day during the summer, right? You have your main goals for that week, that day, whatever. And as you go to these shows, and they're checkpoints, are you moving in the right direction? Or there's some things that you should double check. So I thought it was a great topic for today, everybody.
I did too. And hopefully everyone finds this beneficial, given that the marching band season is just getting underway or about to get underway for a lot of us. So good yearly reminder. I'm sure we'll have more conversations about critique and tapes as we go from season to season, and just ourselves learn and change our conversation. So thanks for joining us. We missed E tonight, but I'm Ryan, joined by John and Robert, and you can check us out at Instagram at Volta Percussion, on YouTube at Volta Percussion, and email us any questions that you might have, or any thoughts that you might have for critique at voltapercussion@gmail.com. Do you have any last second thoughts before we sign off for critique of the upcoming season?
Good luck, everybody.
Good luck, everybody.
All right. Good luck. Thanks.
Bye.